This year, we've got Sonic X Shadow Generations for all modern consoles. If you aren't in the know, Sonic Generations is a game that first released on the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC back in 2011. It was meant to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Sonic the Hedgehog by having modern Sonic team up with his younger self in a time-traveling journey where they played through all the best levels and bosses from the past 20 years of Sonic. Sonic Generations was beloved upon release and remains one of the most well-regarded Sonic games ever released. So now, Sonic Generations is back to be enjoyed all over again by fans old and new, but with it we have the new Shadow Generations expansion. Sega has been promoting Shadow the Hedgehog a lot this year. Shadow's going to be the star attraction of the upcoming Sonic Movie 3, in fact, played by Keanu Reeves. So this year, Sega set up the Year of Shadow, with a lot of merch and social media attention being placed on Shadow the Hedgehog, including the new Shadow Generations game, which serves as a way for longtime fans to be reintroduced to Shadow and his story, and most importantly for new fans to learn all about who the ultimate life form really is, as he runs through many levels and bosses significant to his character. Shadow hasn't really been a focused character for almost 20 years, when he was debatably becoming the main character for a few years back in the 2000s, so it's a much needed reintroduction. But yeah, for the price of $50, you get Sonic Generations and Shadow Generations. Or if you pre-ordered it with the digital deluxe edition, you got a bunch of other stuff, but that's neither here nor there. It's the same game remastered alongside a new one. When this was announced, I was very curious about it. Historically speaking, Sonic remasters have never been that good. Sonic Adventure DX infamously overhauled the visuals in a way a lot of people didn't like and introduced new glitches and issues. The port of Sonic 1 to Game Boy Advance is one of the worst Sonic releases ever, and then more recently you had Sonic Origins with many of the classic games. At launch, it left a lot to be desired, but that one's actually been patched to be improved, so that was nice. But then something like Sonic Colors Ultimate was a total miss in my eyes. The visuals were done over in a really unappealing way, and it included a plethora of bugs and issues that ruined a great game. But anytime I saw footage of the Sonic Generations remaster prior to its release, I thought it looked promising. As in, it looked like Sonic Generations but back and improved for modern hardware. And then Shadow Generations was a whole new game that also piqued my interest. So, is Sonic X Shadow Generations good? Is it worth the price of admission? Does it suck? Well, let's talk about it. Starting simple with Sonic Generations, I gave a brief outline of what this game was a moment ago, but if you've never played it, Generations was a sequel to Sonic Unleashed and Sonic Colors, because Unleashed introduced a new style of gameplay for Sonic where you'd hold a button to blast forward at light speed and had to react to obstacles. Colors took that gameplay and made it slower paced and more focused on platforming and exploration. Sonic Generations took these two different approaches to the same gameplay and unified them into a fantastic game where you went super fast, but also had many hidden pathways to look out for and do platforming and all that good stuff. In it, there are 9 levels from past games. Green Hill from Sonic 1, Chemical Plant from Sonic 2, Sky Sanctuary from Sonic 3, Speed Highway from Sonic Adventure, City Escape from Sonic Adventure 2, Seaside Hill from Sonic Heroes, Crisis City from Sonic 06, Rooftop Run from Sonic Unleashed, and Planet Wisp from Sonic Colors. In Act 2, you play as modern Sonic doing the gameplay I just described, but in Act 1, you play as classic Sonic. His gameplay is meant to be a revival of the original Sonic gameplay from the early 90s. It's not a perfect recreation, but it's a lot of fun to play as classic Sonic nevertheless, because his spin dash will send you flying at incredible speed. The levels in Generations are just a joy to play and replay, but I'm not going to re-review Generations in depth here though. If you want my full thoughts in this game, you can watch the review I did 3 years ago in 2021. It was 40 minutes long and was a lot of fun to do, because Generations has always been one of my favorite Sonic games. I still have the PS3 copy I got back in 2011 to this day, and it still works too. Which is a great segue because while I'm not doing another breakdown on Sonic Generations, I do want to talk about the quality of the remaster, and the game's original console release is the perfect starting point. The game was pretty much going to be better than the original by default. Sonic Generations on PS3 and Xbox 360 ran at 720p and 30 frames per second. It was a step up from Unleashed in that the performance was far more stable, but that came with a cost to the detail and the lighting, which Unleashed excelled at. The loading screens for Sonic Generations on consoles were also pretty long, definitely 10 seconds or more. That didn't stop me from playing this till the buttons broke off when I was 11 though, but it does make the original console version a dated experience. On PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, and PC, you can play Sonic Generations at a high resolution and 60 FPS. PC players, of course, being allowed to customize the resolution and all that good stuff that comes from playing a game on PC. which is how I played Sonic X Shadow Generations for the video. Nintendo Switch players will still have the game at 30 frames per second, but I watched the game from start to finish on the Switch, and I can confirm that the loading screens are much faster on the Switch than they ever were on the consoles from 13 years ago. So it's still a better experience than that. Like I said, it was pretty much guaranteed to be a better experience in 2024 than playing the console version from 2011. Where things get interesting is that Sonic Generations had a PC port back when it came out. This was how a lot of people played the game in the time since its original release. This original PC version of Generations has been delisted from the Steam store. You can't buy it on its own anymore. The only way to buy it is with this Sonic PC bundle, but that's your only choice if you want to get that original version and didn't already have it in your Steam library. I said this is a more interesting comparison because this original PC version already had 60 FPS high-resolution gameplay, so the comparison is more even. Thankfully, I can say that you really can't go wrong either way. If you play it via the original, you get the game exactly how it was at release, which will become important in a moment. And you get to use all the various mods that fan developers created in the last 13 years, which was quite a lot of stuff. I'm sure the modding scene for Sonic X Shadow Generations will be significant as well, but still, the fan community did a lot to support Sonic Generations after it released, and at the time of writing, those mods only work with the original game. The downside is that, since it was an older PC release, it came with this clunky launcher that you had to work with to configure your settings, instead of having the settings in the in-game menu like more recent PC games. So if you want an easier setup, the new version has that. But with this new Sonic Generations, they have added some new content. For starters, different controls. You can play with the legacy controls, which is great, but you can also use a more modern control scheme that's akin to Sonic Frontiers from 2022, which is also the default control scheme that Shadow Generations uses. An example of it is how, in the original Generations, you used the square button to boost, but in the new version you use the R2 button, which is exactly how it was in Sonic Frontiers. In terms of your moves, both modern and classic Sonic can use the drop dash, which was introduced in Sonic Mania from 2017 and has become a central mechanic of the series ever since. For classic Sonic, it's pretty useful as you can pick up speed from the air, but for modern Sonic, it's kinda useless. He can just stomp and then boost, which works far better. But it is there if you wanted it. You don't have to use it. What really sucked though was on PC at least, you could only control classic Sonic with the analog stick and not the D-pad, which was not how the original PC Generations was. But this was how Forces was on PC, so that's an interesting flaw that would persist. Other quality of life features include a red ring tracker in the stages to show which one you've collected, something Sonic Colors had that the OG Generations did not have. The HUD and UI have been updated to be in 4K, lives have been made optional, as they're turned off by default and you can activate them in the settings. And lastly, you can collect 3 Chow in each level. Though I don't think they do anything besides sit in the white space overworld, but if you wanted extra content from Gens, there you go. But really though, gameplay-wise, it's just Sonic Generations again, and in the case of a remaster, that's a compliment of the highest order. If you want to play the game, this is a great version. I don't think the Chow or modern Sonic's drop dash are necessary features, but they don't take away from the game as it was. This was a fantastic game 13 years ago, and it still is that now. I don't know, Sonic Generations is a game that just makes me happy. I remember this game releasing like it was yesterday. It was one of the last Sonic games that came out when I was still a kid, and the pre-release of speculating which older levels would come back and digging through the internet for every screenshot and snippet of gameplay I could get my hands on is something I'm really nostalgic for. And Sonic Generations is as good now as it was in 2011 and all the years in between. But while the game is every bit as good as it was in 2011, there is one controversial element to this remaster that I wanted to talk about. Fans have long talked about how disappointing the story of Generations was, how the game could have been a lot more interesting and done more with its premise. What we got was a series of really basic cutscenes that mostly just saw characters standing around and talking about what's going on, rather than giving us interesting scenes and back and forth dialogue. I've never shied away from saying Sonic Generations has a pretty poor story. My first major popular Sonic video almost 7 years ago said just that. I also went into this during my review of Generations, but now, the people behind Sonic X Shadow Generations have tried to amend this fact by rewriting every single cutscene and redubbing them. Essentially, Generations just got retranslated with a new script. And this is, in my opinion, a supreme mixed bag. For starters, I don't think the redubs sound that good. Mike Pollock as Eggman, for example, is really showing his age. I mean, he just sounds so much more lively in Generations from 2011 than 2024.
Take a good look at yourself, Sonic.
Dr. Eggman!
It's the last look you'll get! before I close your eyes forever. Take a good look at yourself, Sonic.
Dr. Eggman!
It's the last thing you'll see in this world.
Even doing lines that are exactly the same.
If you would be so kind as to explain, Gentleman Genius Dr. Eggman from the future. It will be my pleasure, most excellent and efficacious Dr. Eggman of the past. If you would be so kind as to explain, Gentleman Genius Dr. Eggman from the future. It will be my pleasure, most excellent and efficacious Dr. Eggman of the past.
And then, Roger Craig Smith as Sonic sounds like he's doing an impression of his voice from over a decade ago when he was pretty new to the role of Sonic, when obviously his voice has evolved a lot since then. But that's just the issue inherent to redubbing something over a decade later. The real problem for me isn't even the contents of the rewrite or the quality of the redub, it's more of an issue I have with the idea. But to look at both, I don't have anything personal against the new writer, Ian Flynn. He's a fan of the series and loves working on it. The rewrites are largely inoffensive, but every now and again he'll do this thing I don't like, which is needless references. Like the scene after the Death Egg robot boss fight. In the original, this happens.
We're traveling through time and space!
How did this happen?
In the new version, this happens.
We're traveling through time, Sonic!
Without the time stones?
How did this happen is just a more natural response than a mention of the time stones, especially because the time stones weren't even how Sonic traveled through time in CD anyway. He used the past and future signposts. So there's already more than one way to travel through time in that very game. And then you have rewrites and omissions pertaining to character personalities, like how this happened when classic Sonic met Knuckles in the original.
Hey, did you gain weight?
I thought that was funny. But now it's just more of Knuckles going on about one of the two character traits he has.
Thanks, Sonic. Now then, tell me, where is the rest of my island?
With classic Sonic still looking at his stomach for no reason. Because the scenes haven't been reanimated, they've just been rewritten. And then there's Amy. The new Amy is a character whose crush on Sonic is a thing of the past. They've decided that it's no longer a part of the character, so she's just a friend of Sonic only, re-editing the scenes to pretend this never existed.
You saved me, Sonic! I was afraid I'd never be able to flirt with you again. You saved me, Sonic! I'll be sure to return the favor next time around.
Not really worrying about that right now, Amy.
The thing that makes this difficult to talk about is that now anti-woke grifter buffoons have gotten their hands on it and are complaining about how the woke left is censoring Sonic Generations! As if these people give a shit about Sonic Generations. So I'm not here trying to tell you that Western civilization is on the brink of collapse because the woke feminist activists are coming for Sonic! Because that would be silly. The fact that they're going in this different, more platonic direction with Amy starting in Forces and especially Frontiers just doesn't really bother me. What I am saying here is that I don't like going back and rewriting history in a sense. I get they want synergy between all the products they release. It makes sense, it really does. But to me, art is an experience made by a group of people under a specific context. I feel like trying to fix the story of Generations doesn't work because it's been 13 years and people behind the rewrites didn't work on the original, and the context it was made in is completely different than the original game. Back then, mocking Sonic's friends was just the norm, and Sega was totally playing into it. Sonic would look at the camera and be like, "Wow, what an annoying idiot this guy is!" But now he talks to his friends because Sonic should like these people. This is a genuine improvement. But trying to undo the game's mistakes retroactively just doesn't work for me. I think that's poor preservation of art. I similarly didn't like when Frontiers got a new ending in an update. Seemed insecure to me to go back and redo the ending because people thought the finale sucked. I thought the original ending was better anyway, but at least the new one was an optional side mode. If there was an option for legacy cutscenes here, I wouldn't be complaining. I like playing original versions of games for my videos because it best represents what the artists were trying to achieve, when remasters tend to have issues or bugs that mess with the vision. This remaster gets the gameplay perfect, but as it stands, if I wanted to experience Generations as it was meant to be, I'd probably load up the original version on PC. But that's the thing. This is also Sonic Generations. The story's boring either way and makes me want to skip the cutscenes out of said boredom. The cutscenes are, for the most part, spiritually the same and convey the same information. The examples I used in this segment are the only really noteworthy changes. The rest are pretty harmless. I originally had a several-minute-long rant in this script about the nature of rewriting art history, but this is, again, Sonic Generations. The story sucks originally, and I still think it does now. So in summary, I respect the intention behind rewriting gens. It wasn't good before, and more often than not, what they did with it was pretty harmless. I just think that overhauling a piece of art like this sets a bad precedent. Because they could then just do that for any game in the series they re-released, like Unleashed. Doubt that would go over well with the fans. But if you're looking at the macro level, this is a great and fun and replayable game that is approachable to fans both old and new. Definitely recommend this game. But if you're a freak like me, the rewrites will leave you feeling kinda meh. I hope my point is clear. It's a harmless change, I suppose, I just don't like it inherently. But I think the game is still fantastic and definitely worth playing if you haven't before or want to get back into it. The only major problem I had with the gameplay experience of Sonic Generations back when it came out was that I wanted more of it. The game was really short, even to me as an 11-year-old, I beat it in like a day. And then, the game never got DLC or anything, even if it was built for it. And well, now we have Shadow Generations. What a great segue, am I right? Does Shadow Generations fill the void left behind by how short Sonic Generations was? Well, that's what we're here to talk about, among other things. As Shadow Generations almost is the star attraction here, the marketing is focused far more on this than the remaster. So let's dive into it. I said a moment ago that Sonic X Shadow Generations was made under a much different context than the original Sonic Generations. But how did we get to this point? Well, as established, Generations came out when they started shifting the direction of the series away from the extended cast and just focused on Sonic. After years of critically underwhelming titles, Sonic Colors and Sonic Generations brought a lot of goodwill back to the series. Instead of riding the momentum of Generations and making something new with that framework that people liked, we got Sonic Lost World in 2013. A game I will always remember as the first time I didn't like a new Sonic game. Being 13 might have had something to do with it, but I just didn't like it, and I still don't because I think Sonic Lost World sucks. But there's more time to talk about that game later. After Lost World, Sega tried promoting the series in a big new way with the Boom cartoon and its associated video games and merch, like they had done in previous decades to much success. But this attempt flopped spectacularly since the games were atrocious and received huge media attention for that fact, and the cartoon didn't really take off with the toy-playing aged boy demographic, which is where a lot of these shows get their funding. So that was a lot of money down the drain, and the Sonic series kinda limped on afterwards. Sonic Mania was the only well-received Sonic game to be released in the decade after Generations, and it was a perfect recreation of the classic Sonic gameplay, but that wasn't even developed by Sonic Team. Sonic Team released Forces in that same year, and I think that this is easily one of the worst Sonic Team-made games in the franchise. Utterly creatively bankrupt and not fun to play. I ripped this game to shreds in my video on it from 2 years ago. In 2020, Sonic's favor changed when the live-action film came out. It wasn't going to at first because of how poorly received the design of Sonic was, but they fixed it for the final film and people thought it was a fun, safe family movie. It did pretty well and it brought a lot of life, and more importantly, money back into an IP in desperate need. Also, by the early 2020s, the kids who grew up with those 2000s games with all those characters wanted to see them back in action and wanted to see bigger stories in these games again. So that's what has happened. The Sonic movie sequel was a huge hit, and Knuckles was given more credibility in that than he had seen in years. And we got Sonic Frontiers, which I wasn't that big on, but the game scratched that story, character, epic adventure itch for many fans with its open-world gameplay and huge climactic boss fights. And then, the game was one of the most successful Sonic games in over a decade. We were so back, as the kids say. Which leads to the current year, where fans old and new are hyped to see Shadow the Hedgehog on the big screen, and now he's the star of Shadow Generations, a game I thought could never exist prior to its announcement. The last time a Sonic character other than Sonic was the solo star of a game was Shadow the Hedgehog from 2005, which was not a well-liked game by fans or critics at the time. But now, people who grew up with it are fond of it. Myself excluded, but either way, Shadow making a big comeback was a long time coming, and here we are. So, how is Shadow Generations? By the way, this review is going to contain full spoilers, like I'm not hiding anything here, but if you want a spoiler-free review, it's good. Really good. Now let's get into it. Shadow detected some kind of energy reading on the Space Colony Ark, which led him to believe that the Black Arms were returning. Shadow reaches the Ark, unable to attend Sonic's birthday as a result. But when he finds Black Doom back, he's then sucked into the white space like Sonic and friends did in Sonic Generations. When Shadow wakes up, he has to run through stages significant to his storyline and find a way to stop Black Doom from returning as a result of this time-space anomaly. Which is enough context to get into Shadow Generations. I'd like to begin by saying that, while it has the Generations banner and features the same kind of concept as Sonic Generations, this is a mechanical sequel to Sonic Frontiers, more than it is an extension of Sonic Generations. Which makes sense. Frontiers was the most recent game, but I just figured I'd mention that up top because a lot of my comparisons will be to Frontiers. An example of this is the structure of the game. While both Sonic and Shadow Generations feature their respective protagonists running around white space to find levels, in the former case, that's just a glorified menu screen. In Shadow Generations, it's an open zone, akin to Sonic Frontiers with missions and challenges to accomplish, and the levels are like the cyberspace portions of Frontiers. The white space overworld isn't much to write home about, I suppose, but I actually found this area more fun to run around in than Frontiers' areas. Shadow controls well and moves fast in the overworld, and the objectives he needs to complete like collecting rings under a time limit just felt more challenging than some of the tasks Frontiers would make Sonic do. So this returning element has improved, though the open zone aspect of Frontiers was decent overall since Sonic controlled well in open spaces in that game. It was cyberspace where I didn't like it as much, and that is what I just compared Shadow Gens to. One might think this is where I'm going to start complaining given how I had a very negative response to the cyberspace gameplay in Frontiers, but...
well, there's where you're wrong.
See, I even worked in the Sly Cooper reference, gotta have it in almost every video. But yeah, in theory it's the same thing as cyberspace, but the difference is night and day because of the controls. Even though Frontiers lets players freely adjust the gameplay with physics sliders in the menu, I never felt like it was that great in the actual levels. Sonic hugged corners, he had this long delay between homing attacks, and prior to the update he had no physics when jumping at a high speed. Shadow plays very similarly to Sonic in that game, but it just feels really good here. I don't know how to describe it accurately, I just always felt like I was in perfect control at both low and high speeds. In both narrow passages and wide ones, Shadow felt responsive. It's actually crazy how much better I thought this played than the action stages from Sonic Frontiers. Shadow feels this responsive, but he also feels like he's going at a fast pace, which is something I didn't get from Frontiers prior to the updates. The only criticisms I had were that I wish Shadow's homing attack was slightly faster and that he had more airtime. The homing attack is quicker on the draw than Frontiers, which is good, but I'd still like to be able to rapidly homing attack enemies like you could in older games. The air boost doesn't take you that far, and when jumping at high speed, he doesn't get very far either. The air boost in Unleashed through Generations had some real kick to it, and then I'd say the air boost was the only thing that felt good to use in Sonic Forces, as it would send you flying in an arch. It broke that game's already lame-ass levels, but it is cool in theory, and it was a shame that it didn't make a return in Frontiers. For Shadow Generations, I just always felt like the air boost was just slightly too short, by maybe like a half a second. If it gave slightly more distance, I'd be more confident making perilous jumps. And then the other remark about jumping at a high speed should speak for itself. That's just basic physics that Sonic integrated into his debut game. I don't know why I need to ask for it. But ultimately, these two issues do not present a problem to the play experience of Shadow Generations because I thought the controls were really good, and the levels were perfectly built around them. What sets the gameplay of Shadow Generations apart is how Shadow's Chaos powers are used. Killing enemies in this game fills up your Chaos control meter. When it's full, you can stop time for 5 seconds. This is really rewarding to use. The stages have you use it for quite a lot of stuff, like getting past obstacles quicker in Kingdom Valley, or reaching the rail before it blows in Rail Canyon, or running on missiles in the Space Colony Ark. And flying on these light dash trails too. It's a very versatile time-stopping power. And then Shadow also has a Chaos Spear, which kills smaller enemies and stuns bigger ones. As a bit of a warning, I recommend going into the settings and changing the controls. By default, Chaos Control is on one of the shoulder buttons and Chaos Spear is on the topmost face button. I think you should swap these two. You need to use Chaos Spear while on the move, so it's easier to have it on a shoulder button while doing basic actions like jumping on the face buttons. You don't need to use Chaos Control as much, so it's easier to have it on the triangle button. What's also new in Shadow Generations is the Doom powers, new upgrades that Shadow gets from Black Doom that he doesn't want, but will make use of. The Doom Spear lets Shadow target multiple enemies at once with Chaos Spear, which worked pretty well, even at high speed. The Doom Blast was great. With it, Shadow can combo attack big enemies and then target where he's going to send them flying and then warp to their location to finish them off. This is super useful in platforming and speedrunning, as many of the most exciting skips put this skill to great use. The Doom Surf allows Shadow to traverse in the water with ease. The Doom Morph is supposed to make it easy to grapple to and from, though I thought this one was super unwieldy and led to a lot of deaths. I could just not get to grips with the timing on swinging around. And lastly, you unlock the Doom Wings. You can activate it if you have 50 rings, and you can glide around after an air boost, which is also supremely useful in doing cool speedrunning skips. All of these Doom powers are great because they each provide aid during stages, but you never outright need them like, say, Wisps in Sonic Colors or Lost World. They're often the easiest paths, but you can avoid them with alternate routes that take more skill to reach. And that's the thing that makes these Doom and Chaos powers work so well in Shadow Generations. These are some of the best designed levels in 3D Sonic history. Earlier in this video, I was talking about how Sonic Generations is so great because it mixes what worked about the levels of Unleashed and Colors into a really refined package with lots of replay value and hidden routes and platforming and speedrunning opportunities and all that. Shadow Generations had me concerned when I first saw it, because I can tell it looked like the gameplay was more Frontiers than Generations. Frontiers levels not being that fun in my opinion. My videos on that game and my 3D Sonic level ranking video went into how I thought the level design was super basic and bland. And the levels they borrowed from older games just weren't as fun as they were originally. Some fans worried that Shadow Generations would even have levels akin to Sonic Forces, which, as I also stated, is one of my all-time least favorite games made by Sonic Team. Just Dead Air the video game. But I can confirm that Shadow Generations, much like Sonic Generations, strikes an excellent balance of everything that makes Sonic great. It's not too challenging for newcomers like Unleashed kind of was, nor is it playing itself much of the time like Forces. I will tell you, I was grinning ear to ear while playing Space Colony Arc, Rail Canyon, and Kingdom Valley. This game might have some of the most pathways in the stages of any Sonic game. Differing paths don't automatically make a stage good, because it could just be two automated paths that lead to the exact same point with mysterious Sonic Forces footage on top of this sentence. But no, the paths in Shadow Generations actually feel like they were changing how you experience the levels. You feel like you're in a world that exists and connects in logical ways that give you a lot to explore for, like the collectible tokens that unlock chests in the overworld. But yeah, optimizing your time is really satisfying, and seeing what each stage has to offer is great. Like in Space Colony Arc Act 1, where you find this big open room halfway through. I got into it on the ground from one path, but then on another run, I got into it from higher up because I took a different route in this section in the hallway. That is good open level design. It gives you a reason to play it more than once, and I also want to play it more than once. There were split-second decisions you have to make that had me go, oh shoot, I want to play that level one more time and try that again. Like in Space Colony Arc Act 2, where you can chaos control on top of the missiles to get to the higher route. It's something I could have seen coming, but I reacted too late and missed the higher route as a result. Same thing happened when you need to stun this enemy in Rail Canyon Act 1 to avoid taking damage when homing attacking it. Playing the stage the first time was super fun, and then I could see these little changes I could make to improve my time and keep more of my rings. Kingdom Valley was just absolutely phenomenal in this game. It excelled at everything I just said and was so much fun to do. Like on the water when you jump off to a separate upper route which saw me doom blast this guy like 40 yards away and skip the water section. It was awesome. And the levels are long too. One of my favorite things about the Unleashed stages was how even if you knew what you were doing, they could often take over 3 or 4 minutes. It was a full level. Colors and Generations levels were much shorter by comparison, and then Forces and Frontiers had pitiful stage length, sometimes only lasting a minute. But Shadow Gens has stages that are like 4 minutes that are exciting from start to finish, and that includes the mostly 2D second acts, which are also fun to play for many of the same reasons as the 3D stages. Honestly, my only criticism here is that there aren't more levels, which is quite the compliment since that means I loved it. Which is exactly what I said about Sonic Generations, but the only difference is here. This game doesn't have a bad final level like Sonic Generations did, nor does it have a terrible final boss like that game. So it's a roster of great content. To look at the levels we've got and compare them to the originals, you start with Space Colony Arc from Sonic Adventure 2. This is an obviously great choice for a stage, since the Ark is where Shadow was born, and it was the location that SA2's plot revolved around, up to and including Shadow's death at the end. Though this level is not a singular callback to any one stage. The Ark is a location used for several levels in SA2 and Shadow the Hedgehog, and this level kind of brings in elements from various ones. But its biggest inspiration is Final Rush, Sonic's last level from SA2. That's where the music is from. But Act 2 does bring these spinning platform things back from Final Chase, Shadow's last level in SA2. I was just talking about how great these levels are, but it bears repeating, it was a really great first impression for the game. Next up is Rail Canyon from Sonic Heroes. It makes sense to bring this level back. Heroes saw Shadow return from the dead with amnesia. Rail Canyon is where Shadow, alongside Rouge and Omega, discovered that Dr. Eggman was mass-producing Shadow clones, beginning a mystery regarding whether or not this was the real Shadow or a fake. Something that wasn't resolved until the end of the Shadow game a year later. But I will admit, when this was a confirmed level, I was pretty scared. Rail Canyon and Bullet Station were my two least favorite levels from Sonic Heroes because of how janky the rail physics could get. And also because grinding on rails hasn't been a fun mechanic since SA2. It's been pretty automated in most Sonic games released afterwards, so I was concerned that that's what this level would just be, but it managed to be a lot of fun as well. The mix of chaos control and these timed explosive challenges proved to be great fun in the first run and on repeat runs of the stage. The 2D second act was also a winner. The third level is Kingdom Valley from Sonic 06. This was another natural choice. 06 was the last game where Shadow had a big starring role, and it was a pretty epic climax for his character. Kingdom Valley was Shadow's second level where he and Rouge had stolen the Scepter of Darkness from Dr. Eggman and accidentally got it smashed, releasing Mephiles the Dark, a twisted time-traveling deity with a vendetta against Shadow, who tried making Shadow uncertain of his future to turn him against everyone else, to no avail. And it all began at Kingdom Valley, so it makes sense to pick this from any 06 level. As I said, this is by far the best level in Shadow Generations, putting the horrifically bad original stage to shame since that game's no good. But yeah, the day after I beat Shadow Gens, I went back and played through all the levels a second time, and with Kingdom Valley Act 2, I played it twice back to back because I had some ideas on how to cut down my run, like using chaos control on these pillars before they could lower, giving me access to a higher route, and I was right and it was super fun and satisfying to do. Just such well-designed levels in this game, and Kingdom Valley Act 1 and 2 are both top tier. Next was Sunset Heights from Sonic Forces. Now, I'm sure you might be thinking that I'm about to complain, given the fact that I've taken potshots at Sonic Forces throughout this entire video, but no, I don't really operate like that. I don't really have a problem with acknowledging the existence of Sonic Forces. Forces was the first time Shadow was playable in a Sonic Team game since 06, which is a gap of 11 years. Well, unless you count Black Knight, but still, that's a gap of 8 years. So while the episode Shadow DLC from Forces was pretty underwhelming, it was cool nevertheless how he got to be playable again and had a major role in the backstory of the game by being the reason Infinite became the villain he was in the main story, simply by Shadow kicking his ass when he had no powers. Sunset Heights was a modern Sonic level in Forces, but Shadow played through a nearly identical level called Enemy Territory where he encountered Infinite at the end. The new Sunset Heights also puts the old one to shame. In the original, you ran forward and watched the gameplay itself for most of it. There are some portions of level design here that feel the same as the original, but the stage is so expanded with new routes that it's nothing like the old version. On my second run, I was trying to dodge the rocks being thrown at me by the robots in the distance, so I used chaos control so I could stop time and not take damage, but then I saw you could homing attack them for a higher path, and that was absolutely sick. The underground portion paying tribute to classic Sonic's version of the level as well, only greatly expanded with all the great stage design elements that I've been praising for the past several minutes. Then you get Chaos Island from Sonic Frontiers, and this was a weird one because Chaos Island isn't even a level, it's an overworld from Frontiers, and it's a game that Shadow wasn't even in. The new stages are good though. Definitely my least favorite, however, because of how much they rely on the Doom morph. But ultimately, this level's inclusion is a bit of a head-scratcher. Shadow Generations takes place at the same time as Sonic Generations, which means after Sonic Colors and before Sonic Lost World. But since this was made 13 years later, it is cool that the Time Eater's pulling levels set in the future, and not just the past. But unfortunately, Chaos Island makes it look a lot more like a time and resource restriction than an artistic choice. Sunset Heights is fair game for the reasons I just went into, but Chaos Island is again from a game Shadow wasn't even in. It makes both of these future stages look like they're here for the purposes of reusing assets from relatively recent games to get a few extra levels in. Not a bad thing inherently, especially when the levels are this fun, but it's pretty noticeable. Some fans speculated that since the volcano goes off in Chaos Island Act 1, that means we might see Supersonic's fight with Knight from Frontiers in the background, but unfortunately that didn't come to fruition. It would have been really cool if it had, though. The story could have done good work covering up this asset reuse problem by having Shadow reflect on not knowing what these locations are because he hasn't lived through it yet, / won't even at all. Similarly, I would have liked to see Shadow have a hazy memory of what Kingdom Valley is, but nothing concrete because of how 06 ended with the time travel being used to undo the game's events. But stages being here for asset reuse purposes more than creativity is especially obvious in the last level, Radical Highway from Sonic Adventure 2. It makes sense to have this in the game, this was the first ever Shadow level, but the location is only relevant to the audience. In-universe, Shadow was just escaping the cops and that happened to be the route he took. This level is Shadow taking the fight to Black Doom, so it really should have been the Black Comet from Shadow the Hedgehog, Black Doom's home base. But there are no modern HD assets for them to grab from for that, so they didn't use it. There are a bunch of city assets from a bunch of these games, so paint them red and call it Radical Highway and you're done. That's your last level. Again, absolutely phenomenal final stage in terms of design and replayability, and has a lot of complexity since the stage introduces you to the Doom Wings, but I still think it taking place here is kind of anticlimactic. Some stage choices are better than others, but the boss roster is definitely solid. To access bosses, you need boss keys like Sonic Generations, and you get keys by doing missions for every level in the game. At first, you're given the illusion of choice by not needing all the keys available to collect, but by the end you'll have to do every mission, so you may as well just do them all as they come up. But none of them are bad though, they range from harmless at worst to more of the same fun gameplay at best. But yeah, boss fights here are pretty cool, and were all great picks. You have the Bio-Lizard from SA2, the prototype ultimate lifeform that came before Shadow that he fought at the end of SA2 by himself, and then as Super Shadow alongside Super Sonic. If you've played the original fight, this is pretty much a souped-up version with more attacks, like going in the air and attacking from above, giving you a chance to counter with Chaos Spear. And with it is probably my favorite arrangement of the theme supporting me of all time. Then you have Metal Overlord, the final boss from Sonic Heroes. This is a fight that just uses the Doom Surf, so it doesn't really play much like the original, but it was still a lot of fun to do, and shows how powerful Shadow is by this point that he can destroy Metal Overlord by himself, when before it took Shadow and the efforts of 11 other characters to beat, 3 of which were superpowered. Mephiles the Dark returns for a boss fight as well. And this was a fun fight too, that was probably the only part of the game where I enjoyed using the Doom morph, since you just chased Mephiles on the ground. But what I liked about this fight was how it proved, like I've been saying for years, Sonic 06 is a canon part of the Sonic franchise. It was never a continuity reboot, like people say. Something that should have been obvious in the original generations, but still, 06 happens and then the events are erased, like I was saying before. Something Mephiles references when he's defeated because he knew that beating Shadow here was his only chance to escape his doomed timeline, but Shadow puts him back where he belongs. And then lastly, there's the fight with Devil Doom. But this one was kind of unremarkable compared to the rest. It felt kind of easy to do. But it was nice how it played an epic version of All Hail Shadow at the end. Looking back at it though, I wish they showed less of the game in the pre-release. Back when Sonic Generations was coming out, they also basically showed the whole game before it came out. Neither has a lot of stuff in it, so I suppose it's hard to show new stuff while also not spoiling everything. But I'm just thinking that I wish seeing Mephiles or Chaos Island were surprises. Because in-game, there weren't that many if you watched all the trailers. They did keep the story relatively under wraps though, which is good because Shadow Gens had way more to offer than Sonic Gens ever did in this category. But was it good? Well, I'll say this. I think what Ian Flynn was trying to do with Shadow Generations was pretty heartfelt. Due to the timeline collapse, Shadow is reunited with Professor Gerald and Maria from before the Ark incident that killed Maria. You could probably predict the rest from moment 1, but Shadow gets to see his favorite people again and has to save the world and leave them behind in the ending to go help Sonic in his battle with the Time Eater from Sonic Generations. It's heartfelt because you do see a side of Shadow you've never seen before. Like a scene where he's smiling, not a smirk, but like genuinely happy in a scene. And Shadow cries in the ending. This is the kind of emotion that has not been in a Sonic game in a very long time. Having emotions in a story isn't really a selling point though. I'm just saying that what the writer was trying to do was pretty heartfelt and I thought it was executed well enough. Only thing I don't like is that I wish there was more story. I already said, I wish Shadow had more to say about the levels he's running through and the bosses he's fighting against. They feel kinda disposable, like the game needs to have levels, so you play them and then you get another scene. And then, similar to Sonic Frontiers, I don't feel like a lot is happening in this game despite it having a decent amount of cutscenes relative to its length. Or at least, not a whole lot of new things are happening in this. I like that Gerald talks about Maria's illness and how he failed to cure it on his own, the Bio-Lizard being a failed attempt at the ultimate lifeform, and how Black Doom offering his DNA was the final thing that let him complete Shadow, and how Black Doom is the one who first mastered Chaos Control. Shadow Generations is the first game to link all of these things together in a single scene. In fact, this is the first on-screen mention of Maria's illness at all. You'd need to read the SA2 instruction manual to know that was even what the story was about. The way Maria is written is a little over the top at times, since everything she says is super dramatic, but that's technically how she's always been in every scene she's in. I thought the scene with Sonic was agonizing at first because of how they quote lines directly from SA2 and Heroes. It's a little too self-indulgent for my liking, but the action scene was cool. And it was really clever how they found a way around Shadow needing an emerald for chaos powers, but it also being a plot point that Sonic takes one from Shadow in Sonic Generations. Shadow Generations shows how Shadow had the real yellow emerald, but also brought the fake yellow emerald that Tails made in SA2 with him that has apparently been on the Ark ever since. Shadow just let Sonic take the fake one and had Rouge swap it with the real one later when he wasn't looking. And that was a pretty smart use of old lore. So in short, I think the story is neat in this, but if I were to say my biggest issue, it would be with Shadow's arc. He lets go of anger and fights Black Doom, severing his connection to the alien warlord, and fights on because of Maria's wish for him to protect the Earth. Sad that she's gone, but willing to go on nevertheless. My problem with that is that it's the exact same arc as Shadow the Hedgehog the video game. The various cutscenes from Shadow 05 already explained all the stuff about Black Doom that this game does, and the last story of that game really drove it home. I get that Shadow Gens is meant to be a reintroduction to Shadow for the audience, but canonically speaking, I guess Shadow learns the same stuff and the same lessons twice, something an optional bit of dialogue even points out. Rouge saying to Shadow that he already made the choice to move on. I guess seeing them again could cause him to waver. It's not totally unbelievable, growth isn't linear and all that. And maybe the point of this game is that Shadow can willingly choose to remember the good of Maria and Gerald rather than just not thinking about them anymore. But my overall point is that I like what Shadow Gens is doing a lot of the time. I'm just saying that not much of it is supremely new if you've played SA2, Heroes, Sonic Battle, Shadow, and Sonic 06. The games where Shadow was a key character. But I had this same issue in Sonic Frontiers as well, where it seemed like Tails, Amy, and Knuckles learned lessons they already did in Sonic Adventure 1, so I suppose it's not new. What really carries the story of Shadow Generations for me is the production value. This was an astronomical step up from Sonic Frontiers and the whole last decade of Sonic. Sonic Lost World was the last time these games had the slightest amount of action cutscenes, but really the last time they had them on the regular in a game was Unleashed, which was almost 20 years ago. But Shadow Gens has a lot of cutscenes, and they have cool camera angles, action scenes that look good, and animation that also looks alive. The extra budget this game got because of the recent success of Sonic is pretty evident. The cutscenes show it, but then the graphics look pretty up to par too. It's not going to be Ratchet and Clank quality, because that's top-of-the-line industry stuff as far as cartoony games are concerned, but this more than gets the job done. In-game, there are improvements from Frontiers like the draw distance. The visuals in levels look really good, and then the stages and bosses are loaded with fantastic action scenes. Shadow will punch missiles and fly through the air, and his quills will blow in the wind. This game just looks really appealing, and that's part of selling an action sequence. I said in my Frontiers videos that I didn't really care as much for the action scenes because many of them looked pretty lame. Sonic is not holding this sword he's swinging, nor touching the beam he's blocking here. I just thought it completely took me out of the moment. And Shadow Generations proved how right I was because of how sick it was when Shadow goes in for the kill on the Bio-Lizard.
Take this!
Like I said, these production values were good enough to where I didn't really mind the nitpick I had with the story. I thought it was fun to watch, and I thought the game was fun to play, and that's putting it lightly. With all that said, what does this all represent? I think Shadow Generations is great. It's fun, well-presented, replayable, and gives you things to keep coming back to in the overworld, like concept art, a history lesson on Shadow's character, music, and even Professor Gerald's diary. The one Eggman used in various games as motivation for different schemes. We actually get to read it now. I think it's all pretty cool. I think the game is stellar. But what I mean is, what does this whole Sonic X Shadow Generations package mean for the Sonic series? Well, it's another game starring Shadow, something I never thought would ever happen again just a couple years ago, but it's also a critical darling. Sonic X Shadow Generations is receiving praise almost across the board from all the major gaming outlets. IGN giving it a 9 out of 10, when they gave the original Generations an 8.5 back in 2011, which was already pretty high for Sonic standards. They have a serious hit on their hands with critics and fans. The culture surrounding this game is that it's fantastic from people who aren't like huge Sonic fans or anything, which is a really important detail. Both Sonic and Shadow Generations, these are both really short games. That was the big issue with Sonic Generations. But now it has the Shadow portion, and together it feels like you've got a package worth paying $50 to play. If you like fun action platformers, I wholeheartedly recommend Sonic X Shadow Generations. Any flaw I have with it as a fan freak does not even come close to outweighing how fun this game is and how approachable it is for newcomers to the series. But then something else I just loved about Shadow Generations specifically is how much it improved on Sonic Frontiers. This has been a consistent topic throughout the last 20 minutes or so, but honestly, this game being such a step up from that game legitimately makes me feel more sympathetic towards Frontiers than I was 2 years ago. A lot of people said Frontiers was a step in the right direction when it came out. I was skeptical of this idea because I was there when Lost World came out. I remember people saying, oh, maybe it's not perfect, but they could improve it next time. But for that game, next time never came. And all we were left with was the boring game that doesn't do anything super well that some other game hadn't already done. So I wasn't going to praise Frontiers for its potential. I needed to see it in action. But hey, here we are 2 years later, and now I've seen it. Shadow Generations is that. It took what Frontiers did well and what it was trying to do and failing to do and improving it all in a package that I really liked. That's worth something. And like I said, it makes me look back and think, yes, Sonic Frontiers was a step in the right direction. So I want them to keep it up for the next game. Which leads me to the one lesson I need Sonic Team to learn more than anything else from this game. It is far past time for the nostalgia and returning levels to go. Sonic Generations' gimmick was the nostalgia, and it worked great as a one-time thing. But the biggest mistake Sega made was that they didn't iterate on what made the game fun afterwards. We got the messy Mario clone Sonic Lost World next. And then they tried making another boost game with Forces, and it also had nothing that made Generations fun. It was a dumpster fire. The only thing that the later games retained from Generations was actually its least important aspect, nostalgia. Sonic Lost World was decorated in classic Sonic throwback imagery. Sonic Forces reused Green Hill and Chemical Plant assets from Generations. Sonic Mania had most of its levels brought back from earlier games. While the gameplay was sublime, I thought that the reused levels dampened the game's originality and identity. It made it feel more like a greatest hits album with some new songs and a proper new album to follow up on the classics. Sonic Frontiers not only reused Generations assets for Green Hill, Chemical Plant, and Sky Sanctuary, it also brought back whole level maps from SA2, Unleashed, and Generations, making it so these stages didn't stand on their own. Now, with Shadow Gens, these levels and bosses are great fun, but the only problem I have with the gameplay experience is that I've fought the BioLizard and Herd supporting me before, multiple times. It's exactly what I said about Mania in my review of it. In SA2, the BioLizard fight makes me think of how tough the boss was when I was a kid. It makes me think of Hearing supporting me for the first time. It makes me think of Shadow making the choice to save the day and teaming up with Sonic and all that stuff. In Shadow Generations, it's a great fight, way better than the original, but it just isn't new. It's a callback to what's already been done. We've seen all of this before. Kingdom Valley is superb in Shadow Generations, but it would be even better if it was a new level with new music and iconography. Sonic X Shadow Generations is the most well-received 3D Sonic game since the original Generations. They have a chance here to do what they didn't after that game came out the first time. Take what worked about Sonic and Shadow Generations and give us a truly original adventure with these same great level design choices, and maybe have it be a little longer. Enough with the nostalgia. It's just not really hitting anymore like it did in 2011. I can accept it this one final time because of how it shadows reintroduction to the audience and all that good stuff, but the series has revolved around the past for far too long. It's time for some new stuff. But that's just about all I have to say on this game. I really frickin' loved it, both sides of it, and I only hope that this high bar set by Shadow Generations continues to be expanded in the future. But on that note, only time will tell. So it's about time we ended this video. To close, I'll say the same things I always do. If you made it this far into the video, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.